The hammer rose, a dark crescent against the fiery glow of the forge. For Marcus Daniels, this was not just another strike on hot iron, it was the strike that would shatter his world. He didn't know if it would lead to freedom or the grave, only that the clang of the anvil would be the last sound of his old life. In the chaos of sparks and dust that followed, a man would disappear as if consumed by the smoke itself, leaving behind a legend that would be whispered for generations. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The year was 1842, and the air in the Henderson Plantation Forge was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from coal smoke, the sharp tang of hot metal, and the salt of ceaseless sweat. It was a place of brutal, relentless labor, a discordant symphony of ringing steel, the angry hiss of quenching water, and the groaning bellows that fed the fire's insatiable hunger. Here, in this pocket of hell carved out of the Virginia countryside, Marcus Daniels moved with a grace that defied the chains binding his existence. He was a man of immense physical strength, his arms and shoulders thick with muscle sculpted by years at the hammer and anvil. But it was the sharp, piercing intelligence in his eyes that truly defined him. Every movement was a study in practiced economy, a conservation of energy born from endless repetition. His muscles, coiled and ready beneath his sweat-sheened skin, were tools he commanded with absolute precision. Yet this silent, obedient exterior was a carefully constructed fortress. Inside, his mind was a tempest, a realm of simmering rage, meticulous observation, and a desperate, burning yearning for a life he could only imagine. He was a prisoner, and the forge was his cell. But within the confines of his own thoughts, he was a king plotting the overthrow of his captors. His primary captor, the ever-present symbol of his bondage, was Overseer Finch. Finch was a portly, sweating man whose laziness was as profound as his cruelty. He supervised the forge not on his feet, but from the cushioned comfort of a specially made wooden bench, a throne of indolence positioned just far enough from the heat to be comfortable, yet close enough to cast his shadow over Marcus's work. His cruelty was not the sharp, explosive kind, but a casual, thoughtless malice that dripped from him like the condensation from his ever-present jug of cider. He was a man who found pleasure in the small daily degradations that reminded every soul on the plantation of their place. With every rhythmic, deafening clang of Marcus's hammer against the glowing iron, Marcus felt the familiar weight of his existence. Each blow was a suppressed cry of defiance, a scream of frustration pounded into the unyielding steel. He watched Finch from the corner of his eye, his gaze sweeping over the overseer's bloated form, noting the way he shifted his weight, the rhythm of his breathing as he dozed, the flick of his wrist as he swatted at a fly. He catalogued every habit, every weakness, his contempt a cold, hard knot tightening in the pit of his stomach. The worn wooden handle of the hammer was rough against his calloused palms, a familiar anchor in a world of pain. And he dreamed of a day when the hammer would strike for him and not for the master. The rhythm of the forge was broken. A moment of silence, a pause as Marcus turned to fetch a new piece of iron, was all the provocation Finch needed. The overseer's eyes fluttered open, a scowl twisting his fleshy features. With a grunt, he swung his leg out and kicked over the heavy wooden bucket of quenching water Marcus had just hauled from the well. The cool water splashed across the packed dirt floor, turning the soot and dust into a dark, spreading stain. "Daydreaming, boy?" Finch sneered, his voice a wet, unpleasant sound. "The master pays for sweat, not thoughts." Marcus froze, his back to the overseer. The muscles in his jaw bunched into hard knots. He could feel the heat of the forge on his face and the ice of pure hatred in his veins. He did not turn, did not speak. To give voice to the inferno raging within him would be to invite the lash, and he had plans that a scarred back would only complicate. He simply stood for a beat, a statue of controlled fury before turning slowly to survey the mess. Finch watched him, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Clean it up," he commanded, taking a long swallow of cider from his jug. "And be quicker about it. This humidity makes a man thirsty." Marcus bent down, his movements deliberate and measured, betraying none of the storm within. He grabbed a handful of straw and began sopping up the muddy water, his mind a razor-sharp blade. This small, daily act of degradation was nothing new. It was one of 1,000 such humiliations he had endured. But something about this one, the casualness of it, the sneer in Finch's voice, felt different. It was a final straw laid upon a mountain of injustice. As he cleaned the filth from the floor, Marcus made a silent, solemn vow. He would never be humiliated by this man again. Finch's power over him, his very life, would soon come to an end. Later that week, the oppressive air of the forge was disturbed by a different presence. Master Henderson, the owner of the plantation, made one of his infrequent visits. Henderson was a tall, lean man who carried himself with an air of unshakable authority. He valued two things above all else, profit and appearances, and he saw the people he owned as mere entries in a ledger, assets to be managed and, when necessary, liquidated. He ran a hand over the cool, intricate scrollwork of a newly forged iron gate that leaned against the wall, a testament to Marcus's artistry. "Exquisite work, Marcus. Truly," Henderson said, his voice smooth and polished, a stark contrast to Finch's brutish tones. "Your value increases with every piece." He spoke of Marcus not as a person, but as an investment yielding a handsome return. He then turned his cold, calculating gaze to the overseer who had scrambled to his feet, a fawning expression on his face. "I have a buyer coming from Louisiana next week," Henderson continued, his voice dropping slightly. "He's looking for surplus hands. We need to make sure our inventory is in prime condition." The words, surplus hands and inventory, hung in the smoky air, chilling the searing heat of the forge. It was a veiled threat, a reminder that everyone was disposable. At that moment, a small figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. It was Eliza, Marcus's 5-year-old daughter, her small face serious as she carried a tin cup of water for her father. As Henderson spoke, his gaze drifted from Finch and fell upon the child. He stopped speaking, his head tilting slightly as he appraised her. He looked at her the way a farmer looks at a promising young foal, his eyes scanning her small frame, calculating her future worth. The abstract threat of being sold south, a constant dull fear in the back of every slave's mind, suddenly became a terrifyingly concrete possibility, aimed directly at the heart of Marcus's world. A wave of cold terror, far more chilling than any quenching bucket, washed over him. The need to act, once a simmering coal, now roared into an inferno. It was no longer a question of if, but when, and the answer was now. That night, the cramped slave cabin felt smaller than ever, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The air was thick with the unspoken fears that haunted their every waking moment. Marcus sat on the edge of his straw mattress, the tension radiating from him in palpable waves. His daughter Eliza slept soundly in the corner, her small chest rising and falling in the innocent rhythm of a child's dream. Sarah, his wife, came to sit beside him. She possessed a quiet, fierce strength and an intuitive understanding of her husband that transcended words. She simply placed a hand on his arm, her touch a small point of warmth in the cold darkness, feeling the rigid, unyielding tension in his muscles. She had seen it too. She had been tending the small garden behind their cabin when Henderson had made his visit, and she had seen the look in the master's eyes. "I saw his eyes, Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely a breath of sound in the stillness of the night. "The way he looked at our Eliza. like she was a foal in a paddock ready for sale. Her words gave voice to the terror that had been clawing at him for hours. He turned to look at her, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls, he could see the reflection of his own fear and rage in her eyes. "He will not take her," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "I will not let him. The time is now, Sarah. The plan we spoke of, it has to be now." There was no question in his voice, only the grim finality of a decision made. The scene was filled with a mixture of heart-stopping terror and a grim, unshakable determination. They were united in their purpose, their shared love for their child forging an unbreakable bond of conspiracy. The spark of rebellion, long nurtured in the secret corners of Marcus's heart, had finally been fanned into a flame, and it would soon consume everything in its path. The forge was meant to be silent after dark, a sleeping beast whose fiery breath had been extinguished until dawn. But tonight, a faint rhythmic scraping sound whispered from within its stone walls. Marcus worked under the pretense of finishing a set of hinges for the new smokehouse, a task Henderson had demanded with impatient urgency. The lie had been easy, a simple request to Finch for a few extra hours of work, a request the overseer, lazy and eager to curry favor with the master, had granted with a dismissive wave. Now, with the forge door barred from the inside and only a single low-burning lantern casting long, dancing shadows, Marcus was engaged in his true work, the work of liberation. He knelt beside the massive oak stump that served as the anvil's stand, its surface scarred and blackened from decades of use. In his hand he held a small, razor-sharp chisel, a tool he had forged himself for fine detail work. He worked on the side of the stand hidden from the main entrance, the side that faced the damp, perpetually shadowed rear wall. With painstaking care, he began to carve away at the thick wooden legs, not enough to weaken them to the point of collapse under the anvil's immense weight, but just enough. He chipped away slivers of wood following the grain, creating a subtle internal weakness that would be invisible to a casual observer. Each chip of wood that fell to the dirt floor was a step closer to freedom, a prayer whispered into the heart of the wood. The sound was agonizingly loud in the stillness, a constant threat of discovery. He would work for a minute, then freeze, his head cocked, listening to the night sounds of the plantation, the distant bark of a dog, the chirp of crickets, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. When he was satisfied with the depth of the cuts, he reached for a small pot containing a thick black paste, a mixture of soot scraped from the chimney and grease skimmed from the quenching trough. With his fingers, he meticulously worked the paste into the fresh cuts, smearing it over the raw wood, camouflaging his sabotage until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding grime. He ran his hand over the surface, the texture now seamless, the deception complete. He stood back, his eyes tracing the familiar, formidable shape of the anvil, the instrument of his long bondage. He felt a profound and bitter irony in this moment. For years, he had used the tools of his enslavement to create objects of beauty and utility for the man who owned him. He had forged gates to keep others out, and chains to keep his own people in. Now he was using those same tools, that same forge, to engineer his own liberation. The forge, the very symbol of his captivity, was being transformed, reforged into the instrument of his escape. The next day, under the pretense of gathering sassafras for Sarah to use in tea, Marcus made his way to a secluded spot at the edge of the woods, a place where the manicured fields of the plantation gave way to the untamed wilderness. Here, beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree, he found Elias. The old man was sitting on a fallen log, his gnarled hands methodically stripping willow bark. Elias was the keeper of the plantation's collective memory, a living library of stories, remedies, and secrets. He had seen generations of masters and slaves come and go, and his eyes held the deep, quiet wisdom of a man who had survived it all. He knew the old ways, the secret paths through the woods, the language of the wild that whispered on the wind. He looked up as Marcus approached, his gaze knowing, as if he had been expecting him. Marcus did not waste time with pleasantries. The air of conspiracy was too thick, the stakes too high. "The time has come," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. "I need the path you spoke of." Elias nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "It is a hard road, son," he said, his voice a dry rustle like autumn leaves. "The North Star is your guide, but the night has teeth. It will try to chew you up and spit you out." He pointed a long, bony finger towards the dense, dark line of trees that marked the beginning of the swamp. "Follow the Blackwater Creek until you see the 3 great oaks that were struck by lightning. They stand together on the far bank, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Turn west from there. The swamp will hide your scent, but it will also try to swallow you whole. Keep your wits about you. There are friends in the Quaker settlements beyond, but trust no one your gut tells you to fear. Some white folks will help you, but others will sell you back for a handful of silver." Elias reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a handful of crushed, fragrant root. He poured it into a small cloth bundle and tied it shut. "For the dogs," he explained, handing it to Marcus. "They hate the smell. When you get to the creek, scatter some of this on the bank. It will throw them off your trail." Marcus took the small pouch, the pungent, earthy smell of the sassafras filling his nostrils. It was a small thing, a handful of crushed root, but it felt as valuable as gold. It was a key, a piece of the puzzle, a tangible piece of hope. He had the knowledge. Now he needed the means. The next morning, the main house kitchen was a hive of activity. Sarah, her face a mask of calm, was at the center of it, kneading a massive trough of dough for the day's bread. Her movements were practiced and efficient, but inside her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Her part in the plan was as dangerous as Marcus's, a delicate dance of deception in the very heart of the enemy's stronghold. She waited for her moment, her eyes scanning the kitchen, noting the positions of the other house slaves, the cook, the master's personal servants. The opportunity came when the cook sent a young boy to the pantry to fetch a new sack of flour. Sarah intercepted him, her voice calm and steady. "Let me get that, child. It's too heavy for you." She heaved the heavy sack onto her shoulder, her muscles straining. As she walked back into the kitchen, she stumbled, a carefully orchestrated misstep. With a cry of feigned surprise, she let the sack fall. It hit the floor with a dull thud, and a massive cloud of white flour erupted into the air, blanketing everything in a fine white powder. The kitchen was thrown into chaos. The cook shouted, the other servants coughed and waved their hands in front of their faces, their eyes stinging. In that moment of confusion, Sarah moved. She slipped into the pantry, her heart pounding. Her eyes darted around the shelves, her mind a whirlwind of calculation and fear. She grabbed a small, sharp paring knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. She took a tinderbox, its contents precious and essential. From a high shelf, she pulled down a bundle of dried, salted meat and a handful of hardtack biscuits, wrapping them quickly in a piece of cloth. She tucked the small, precious bundle into the folds of a roll of laundry waiting to be taken out. The entire act took less than 10 seconds. When she emerged from the pantry, her face was dusted with flour, her expression one of apologetic distress. No one had noticed. Her hands trembled as she helped clean up the mess, but her face was a mask of serene composure. Every action was fraught with peril. A single mistake, a single suspicious glance could doom them all. Her fear was a constant, suffocating companion, but her love for her family, her burning desire to see them free, was a fire that burned even hotter. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky, Marcus found himself behind the forge. The air here was always cool and damp, the ground perpetually soft from the overflow of the large quenching trough. He knelt beside the stone foundation wall, a section that had been loose for a generation, a secret passed down from slave to slave, a hidden flaw in the master's world. He ran his hands over the familiar stones, feeling the cracks and fissures between them. With a small, flat piece of iron, he began to work the same mixture of grease and soot he had used on the anvil stand into the cracks around the stones. He worked it in deep, ensuring that the stones, when the time came, would slide out quickly and, most importantly, silently. As he worked, he felt a profound shift within him. The plan, once a desperate, formless dream whispered in the dark, was now a sequence of concrete, actionable steps. The sabotaged anvil stand, the elder's wisdom, Sarah's courage, and now this hidden exit. Each piece was in place. The anvil strike would provide the noise and the chaos, the eruption of dust and steam would provide the cover, and this hidden opening, this secret door known only to the oppressed, would be his gateway to a new world. The last night was an eternity of silence. The cabin was a small, fragile bubble in a sea of darkness, holding the three of them together for what might be the last time. Eliza slept between them, her small body a warm, comforting weight, her breath a soft, steady rhythm in the stillness. Marcus lay on his back, his eyes wide open, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling. He could feel Sarah beside him, her body as tense and still as his own. No words were needed. Their shared gaze in the darkness communicated everything, their terror, their love, their desperate, fragile hope. After a long while, he reached under his mattress and pulled out a small object. It was a piece of iron he had forged in secret, twisting and shaping the hot metal into the delicate form of a tiny bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. He pressed it into Sarah's hand. "To remember me," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Until we meet again." The words were a promise, a prayer, a desperate gamble against a future that was terrifyingly uncertain. He held his sleeping daughter, memorizing the feel of her small, warm body in his arms, the scent of her hair, the soft curve of her cheek. The enormity of his decision pressed down on him with a physical weight. He was leaving everything he had ever known, his wife, his child, the familiar faces of the people he had grown up with, the very ground beneath his feet. He was plunging into a dangerous, unforgiving unknown, a world where every hand could be an enemy, every shadow a threat. The guilt of leaving them, of placing this terrible burden on Sarah's shoulders, was a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. But beneath the guilt, beneath the fear, was a cold, hard certainty. This was the only way. To stay was to condemn his daughter to the same fate as him, to watch her spirit be crushed under the heel of bondage, to see her sold and shipped off like a piece of livestock. To leave was to give them a chance, a glimmer of hope in a world of darkness. He was not just running from slavery, he was running towards a future he would have to hammer into existence with his own two hands. The day broke with an unnatural stillness. The usual morning chorus of birdsong was muted, replaced by the high, incessant chirping of cicadas that sounded like 1,000 tiny clocks counting down to an unknown, terrible event. The air over the Henderson plantation was heavy and expectant, thick with a humidity you could feel on your skin, a damp, oppressive blanket that promised a storm that would not come. The light, when it finally filtered through the tall pines, did not bring its usual warmth or clarity. Instead, it slanted in long, ominous shafts, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. It was a day that felt poised on the brink of something, a held breath before a scream. As Marcus walked from the cabin toward the forge, his every step felt deliberate, heavy as if he were wading through water. He did not look back. He could not. He could feel Sarah's presence behind him, a fixed point of love and terror in the suffocating air. They had shared a final fleeting glance as he stepped out of the cabin door, a look that passed between them like a physical blow. It was a look that contained a lifetime of shared moments, of quiet joys and constant fears, of whispered dreams and the harsh reality of their existence. It was a look of unbearable love, a desperate, silent plea for his safety, and a terrifying acknowledgement of the abyss he was about to step into. In her eyes, he saw his own fear reflected back at him, but he also saw a strength that fortified his own resolve, a shared sacrifice that was the ultimate act of love. Sarah turned away, her movement stiff with a forced composure that was a masterpiece of self-control. She picked up a basket of laundry, a mundane task that felt absurdly normal on a day when their world was about to be torn apart. Her mind was a screaming chaos of prayer and panic, every fiber of her being wanting to run to him, to pull him back from the precipice. But she held herself still, her face a placid mask. Her role was to be the anchor, the point of normalcy in the coming storm. She had to be the grieving, ignorant wife, a performance that had to be flawless, for her life and Eliza's depended on it. Each step she took toward the main house was a step away from him, a step into a future she could not imagine. The weight of the laundry basket was nothing compared to the weight of the secret she carried in her heart. Marcus reached the forge, the familiar smell of old smoke and cold iron wrapping around him. He paused at the entrance. His hand resting on the rough wooden door, he took a deep breath, the humid air filling his lungs. This was it. The final morning of his life as Marcus Daniels, slave. Everything that came after this moment was unknown, a terrifying void of possibility. He could be dead by noon, his body hanging from a tree as a warning to others, or he could be free. The two possibilities were so extreme, so absolute, that his mind could barely contain them. He pushed open the door and stepped into the familiar gloom, the countdown of the cicadas fading as the stone walls enclosed him. The forge was a tinderbox of tension, waiting for a spark. Midday arrived, bringing with it the peak of the oppressive heat. Finch, true to form, was dozing on his bench, his head lolling to one side, a soft, wheezing snore escaping his parted lips. A half-empty jug of cider rested on the dirt floor beside him, a testament to his morning's labors. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and the rhythmic panting groan of the bellows as Marcus worked. He moved with a focused intensity that was different from his usual practiced rhythm. There was a sharpness to his movements, a coiled energy that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. He was a living weapon, honed and ready. With a pair of long-handled tongs, he reached into the heart of the forge, the coals glowing with a white, blinding heat. He pulled out a massive, glowing billet of iron, a rectangular block of metal that pulsed with contained energy. The heat that radiated from it was immense, a physical force that washed over him, scorching his eyebrows and making the sweat on his face instantly evaporate. He swung the glowing billet onto the anvil, the heavy iron landing with a solid, satisfying thud. He positioned it carefully, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He took a deep breath. His entire life, his past, his present, his desperate, uncertain future, all narrowing to this single explosive moment. He reached for the heavy sledgehammer, its familiar weight a comfort in his hands. He swung it back, his powerful shoulders and back muscles bunching, the head of the hammer a dark crescent against the fiery glow of the iron. This was the strike, but instead of bringing the hammer down onto the glowing billet, he pivoted on the balls of his feet, a movement of surprising speed and grace. With a guttural roar that was torn from the very depths of his soul, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and defiance. He swung the sledgehammer in a wide, horizontal arc. He put every ounce of his strength, every year of his bondage, every lash of the whip, every casual humiliation, every stolen dream into that single, final blow. The hardened steel face of the hammer connected with the hardened steel horn of the anvil itself. The impact did not create the familiar ringing clang of the forge. It created a sound that was utterly alien, a deafening, explosive crack that was like a bolt of lightning striking at close range. It was a sound of metal screaming in protest, of physics being violated. The shockwave of the impact reverberated through the air, through the stone walls, through the very ground beneath their feet. The physics of the blow, combined with the meticulously sabotaged stand, worked with devastating perfection. The half-ton anvil. Its support system shattered, tipped sideways as if in slow motion. It hung in the air for a fraction of a second, a monstrous dark shape against the fire before it crashed down onto the wooden bench where Finch was sleeping. The sound of the anvil hitting the bench was a sickening crunch of splintering wood and breaking bone, a wet final sound that was somehow more horrifying than the initial explosion of noise. In the same instant, the glowing billet of iron dislodged from the anvil fell to the damp earth floor. It hit the ground with a furious hiss, and a massive cloud of dust, soot, and steam erupted, plunging the entire forge into a swirling, impenetrable darkness. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated chaos, a sensory overload of sound and sudden, blinding darkness. In that single planned moment of pandemonium, Marcus moved. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. He dropped the hammer, its handle still vibrating from the force of the impact. He slipped behind the large, overflowing quenching trough, his movements swift and silent as a shadow. His hands found the familiar shapes of the greased stones in the foundation wall. He pried them loose, the stones sliding out with a soft, sucking sound. He squeezed his body through the dark, narrow passage beyond, pulling the stones back into place behind him. The entire action, from the moment of the strike to his final disappearance, took less than 5 seconds. He was gone. For a few moments, the only sound in the forge was the soft settling of dust and the faint, angry hiss of the hot iron cooling on the floor. Then the shouts began. The explosive crack of the anvil had been heard all across the plantation, a sound so loud and unnatural that it had stopped everyone in their tracks. Field hands, house slaves, even Master Henderson himself came running toward the forge, their faces a mixture of alarm and curiosity. They burst through the door, their eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. They were met with a scene of utter destruction and confusion. The air was still thick with a choking gray cloud of dust and steam, making it difficult to see, difficult to breathe. As the dust began to settle, the scene was revealed in horrifying detail. The massive anvil lay on its side, half buried in the splintered remains of what had once been the overseer's bench. Beneath the anvil, a single booted foot and a swatch of stained cloth were visible. Of Finch, there was no other sign, but of Marcus there was nothing, no body, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. Only his sledgehammer lay on the dirt floor, its heavy steel head still radiating a faint, shimmering warmth in the dim light. A field hand, a young man named James, was the first to speak, his voice a choked whisper. "He's gone. Lord have mercy, he's just gone." He stared at the empty space where Marcus had been standing only moments before, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The other slaves murmured amongst themselves, their voices low and hushed. They looked at the toppled anvil, at the motionless form of the overseer, at the empty space where the blacksmith should have been. It was impossible. A man could not simply vanish into thin air. An older woman, Her face a mask of deep spiritual reverence, shook her head slowly. "The forge spirits took him," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that sent a shiver through the crowd. "That anvil, it's a powerful thing. It has a spirit of its own. It got tired of Finch's wickedness. It rose up and took him, and it swallowed Marcus whole to protect him." The words hung in the dusty air, and in that moment the legend was born. The impossibility of the event, the sheer physics-defying nature of a man vanishing from a sealed room, gave birth to a myth that was more powerful, more believable than any logical explanation. It was a story of supernatural intervention, of a righteous spirit rising up to smite the wicked and protect the innocent. It was a story of hope, a story that whispered that even in the darkest of places, there were forces at work beyond the master's control. The silence that followed the anvil's echo was filled with the birth of a new folklore, a tale of a man who had not run but had been taken, a man who had walked into the smoke and sparks and been consumed by the fire of his own defiance. Master Henderson arrived at the forge not with the haste of a man concerned for another's welfare, but with the thunderous stride of a king whose castle had been breached. His face, normally a mask of placid authority, was a mottled canvas of purple and red, his lips a thin white line of suppressed fury. The sight of the toppled anvil and the splintered bench was an offense, but the motionless form of his overseer beneath it was merely an inconvenience, a broken tool that could be replaced. The true source of his rage, the intolerable insult that made the blood pound in his temples, was the empty space, the absence of Marcus, the loss of his most valuable asset, not to death or accident, but to an act of blatant, impossible defiance, was a direct assault on the very foundation of his power. It was a mockery of his ownership, a declaration that a man he considered property had a will of his own, and the audacity to exercise it. He stalked through the crowd of silent, wide-eyed slaves, his presence sucking the air from the room. He kicked aside a piece of the broken bench with a savage grunt, his eyes scanning the scene, searching for any sign, any clue that would restore order to his shattered sense of control. But there was nothing. Only the lingering smell of ozone from the strike, the oppressive dust, and the profound, gaping emptiness where his blacksmith should have been. The legend that was already taking root in the whispers of his slaves was a poison, a dangerous idea that could spread like wildfire. He had to crush it, and he had to make an example of the man who had dared to plant its seed. He spun around, his furious gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, daring any of them to meet his eye. "Find him!" he roared, his voice cracking with the force of his rage. The sound echoed in the suddenly silent forge, a raw, primal command. "I want him found. $1,000 for the man who brings him back alive. I'll make an example of him that will be remembered for a century." The promise of $1,000, an astronomical sum, hung in the air, a testament to the depth of his fury. He wanted Marcus back not for his value as a smith, not anymore. He wanted him back as a symbol. He would see him broken, whipped, and hung, a gruesome spectacle to remind every slave on his land and in the entire county of the absolute, unshakable nature of his power. The echo of the anvil had been an act of rebellion, but the echo of Marcus's punishment would be an act of total, brutal subjugation. Within the hour, Deputy Reed arrived from the county seat. Reed was a local lawman, a pragmatic and methodical man who had built his career on the simple principle that for every effect, there was a logical, tangible cause. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or superstition, and he viewed the world as a series of puzzles that could be solved with patience, observation, and a firm belief in the predictable nature of human behavior. The story that greeted him at the Henderson plantation, a tale of a man vanishing into smoke, was not just a puzzle. It was a professional offense. It was an affront to his entire worldview. He listened with a furrowed brow as a flustered Henderson recounted the events, dismissing the slave's whispers of forge spirits with an impatient wave of his hand. Reed questioned the witnesses himself, his voice calm and even, his eyes sharp and probing. One by one, they told the same impossible story. Marcus was there one moment swinging the hammer and gone the next. The air filled with dust and steam, and when it cleared, he had simply vanished. Reed's gaze swept over the scene of destruction. He examined the walls, running his hands over the rough stone, tapping them, listening for any hollow sound. He inspected the packed dirt floor, searching for any sign of a trapdoor or a tunnel. He even had one of his men climb onto the roof to check for any opening, any possible means of escape. He found nothing. The forge was a sealed box of stone and wood. His investigation inevitably led him to the rear of the forge, to the large quenching trough. The area was dark and damp, the stones of the foundation slick with grime and moss. He knelt, his pragmatic eyes scanning the wall, his fingers probing the cracks. He felt the loose stones, the ones Marcus had slipped through, but to his cursory inspection they felt no different from the rest. They had been hastily pushed back into place from the outside, and the mud, grease, and generations of accumulated filth that Marcus had so carefully worked into the cracks now served as a perfect natural camouflage. The opening was invisible, a secret hidden in plain sight. Reed stood up, wiping his muddy hands on his trousers, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He turned to Henderson, his expression one of pure, unadulterated bafflement. "It makes no sense," he said, his voice low with frustration. "Men don't just vanish into smoke, Mr. Henderson. There's a logical explanation here, and I will find it." But as he looked around the silent, cavernous forge, at the impossible scene before him, a sliver of doubt, cold and unwelcome, began to creep into his methodical mind. This wasn't just a runaway slave, it was a riddle that defied his understanding of the world, a lock for which he had no key. His search for a key led him inevitably to Sarah. He found her on the small, rickety porch of her cabin, holding Eliza in her lap, rocking back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion. She looked up as he approached, her face a mask of such profound, believable grief that it momentarily gave him pause. Her eyes were red and swollen from weeping, her body trembled with a barely controlled tremor, and she clutched her daughter as if she were the last solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. This was her performance, the performance of a lifetime, and she poured every ounce of her fear, her love, and her steely resolve into it. "Ma'am," Reed began, his voice softer than it had been with the others, "I need to ask you some questions about your husband." Sarah's face crumpled, and a fresh wave of sobs shook her body. "My Marcus," she choked out, burying her face in Eliza's hair. "They say he's gone. Just gone." While her face showed nothing but the raw despair of a terrified, abandoned wife, her inner monologue was a torrent of frantic prayer and ice-cold focus. She could feel Reed's eyes on her, probing, searching for any crack in her facade. She knew that one wrong word, one flicker of hope or defiance in her eyes could expose everything. She was walking a tightrope over a canyon of fire, and the lives of her family depended on her not falling. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her own eyes swimming with manufactured tears. "Did he say anything to you?" Reed pressed gently. "Was he acting strangely? Was he in some kind of trouble?" Sarah shook her head, a gesture of helpless confusion. "He was quiet lately, sir," she whispered, her voice raspy with sorrow. "Full of worry. I could feel it on him when he slept. But he never said nothing to me. Marcus, he kept his burdens to himself, to protect us." She looked down at Eliza, her expression a perfect blend of maternal love and heart-wrenching fear. "Oh, Lord, what's become of my Marcus? Who would do this? Who would take him from us? Her performance was flawless. She was not just a grieving wife, she was a woman utterly bewildered, a victim of a tragedy she could not comprehend. Reed, the man of logic and reason, found himself looking at a woman consumed by an emotion so powerful and raw that it seemed to defy analysis. He saw no deception, no conspiracy, only the devastating aftermath of an impossible event. He left her with a few words of empty comfort, his notebook no fuller than it had been before. The puzzle of Marcus's disappearance growing deeper and more inscrutable with every dead end. The next morning the hunt began in earnest. Henderson, sparing no expense, had assembled a formidable search party. It included a dozen armed men on horseback and, most importantly, a pack of hounds renowned for their tracking abilities. The dogs were brought to the forge, their lean bodies trembling with eagerness, their noses twitching as they drank in the lingering scent of their quarry. They were given a piece of Marcus's clothing to smell, and then they were let loose. The hounds immediately picked up the trail, their excited bays echoing across the plantation. They followed the scent from the forge, a clear, undeniable path that led away from the slave quarters and toward the dense, dark woods that bordered the property. The horsemen followed, their faces grim and determined. The promise of $1,000 a powerful motivator. The trail was strong, leading them through a stand of pines and into a clearing. Sarah, watching from a distance as she carried a bucket of water from the well, felt her heart stop. She had done her part, but would it be enough? The dogs were relentless, their instincts honed by years of tracking runaway slaves. The hunt continued, the baying of the hounds growing more confident as they closed in on the Blackwater Creek. They burst from the trees and onto the muddy bank, the place where Elias had instructed. The place where Sarah, on her way to the main house hours before the anvil fell, had walked with a feigned limp, scattering the crushed sassafras root Elias had provided. The lead hound, its nose to the ground, suddenly stopped. It let out a confused whine. Shaking its massive head as if to clear it, the pungent alien scent of the sassafras overwhelmed its senses, a chemical wall that completely erased the familiar human smell it had been tracking. The other dogs piled up behind the leader, their confident bays turning into a cacophony of frustrated yelps and whines. They circled the area, sniffing frantically, their tails low, their sense of smell, their greatest weapon, rendered utterly useless. The trail had not just faded, it had vanished completely at the water's edge. The hunters cursed, urging the dogs on, but it was no use. The scent was gone, swallowed by the creek and obliterated by the invisible magic of the sassafras. The failure of the hounds was a devastating blow to the search party, but it was a powerful victory for the legend of Marcus. The news spread through the slave quarters like a gust of wind, a whispered confirmation of what they already believed. The dogs, the master's ultimate tool of pursuit and capture, had been defeated. It was proof that Marcus was not just a man on the run, but a man protected by forces beyond the master's control, by the spirits of the forge, by the ancient magic of the earth itself. For Henderson, it was another infuriating, inexplicable setback, another crack in the foundation of his authority. The echo of the anvil had not just shattered a bench, it had shattered the illusion of his omnipotence, and in its place, a powerful and dangerous silence was growing. A silence filled with the ghost of a man who had refused to be owned. The world beyond the forge was not a world of freedom. It was a world of water and shadow. Marcus had plunged into the great dismal swamp, a labyrinth of black water, ancient cypress trees, and curtains of Spanish moss that hung from the branches like the tattered shrouds of forgotten ghosts. The air was not air, it was a thick, wet blanket that clung to his skin, making every breath a conscious effort. The oppressive humidity was a constant presence, a suffocating weight that sapped his strength and blurred the edges of the world into a hazy green and brown watercolor. The sun was a distant theoretical concept, a pale, diffused light that barely penetrated the dense canopy above, leaving the world below in a perpetual twilight. His guide was the North Star, a faint, shimmering promise that he could only glimpse in fleeting moments through breaks in the foliage. His map was the memory of Elias's words, a fragile thread of knowledge in this overwhelming wilderness. He followed the sluggish ink-black water of the creek, his feet sinking into the soft, sucking mud with every step. The swamp was alive, but its life was alien and menacing. The constant high-pitched buzz of insects was a torment, a cloud of tiny vampires that feasted on any exposed piece of his skin, leaving him covered in itching, painful welts. The smell of the place was the smell of decay, of damp earth, of life and death endlessly cycling into one another, a rich, cloying perfume that filled his nostrils and coated the back of his throat. At night, the swamp came alive with a different chorus of sounds, the deep, guttural croak of bullfrogs, the splash of unseen creatures slipping into the water, the rustle of things moving in the undergrowth just beyond the reach of his vision. It was a terrifying symphony of the unknown, and it gnawed at the edges of his resolve. He was hungry, a deep, gnawing ache in the pit of his stomach that the few pieces of dried meat Sarah had packed could not satisfy. He was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that made his limbs feel like lead. He was covered in a thick layer of mud and grime, his clothes torn, his skin scratched and bleeding. But for the first time in his life, he was the sole author of his own movements. Every step, every decision, every painful, gasping breath was his and his alone. This realization was a strange and powerful counterpoint to his physical misery. He was profoundly lonely, the silence of his own thoughts a stark contrast to the constant noise of the plantation. But it was a loneliness born of solitude, not of subjugation. He reflected on the nature of freedom as he waded through the murky water, the cold shock of it a welcome distraction from the heat. Was it just the absence of chains, the lack of a master's voice telling him when to wake, when to work, when to sleep? Or was it something more? Here, in this brutal, unforgiving wilderness, he was more vulnerable than he had ever been, yet he felt a thrilling, terrifying sense of self-determination. He was no longer an asset in a ledger, a piece of property. He was a man moving through the world on his own terms, and that knowledge was a fire in his belly that burned brighter than any forge. Days bled into one another, marked only by the subtle shifts in the dim light. He had lost track of how long he had been in the swamp when the sound reached him. It was faint at first, a distant rhythmic baying that was horribly familiar. Hounds. His blood ran cold. It couldn't be Henderson's men, not this deep in. The sassafras in the creek should have thrown them off for good. This was a different pack then. A patrol of slave catchers, the freelance predators who roamed the wild spaces between plantations, sniffing for the scent of profit. The baying grew louder, closer, punctuated by the rough shouts of men. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He looked around frantically, his eyes darting through the cypress knees and tangled roots. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The water. It was his only chance. He found a thick, hollow reed, broke off a section, and took a deep, shuddering breath. He waded deeper into the creek, the black water rising to his chest, his neck, his chin. The shouts were alarmingly close now. He could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth. He put the reed in his mouth, pinched his nose, and submerged himself completely. The world went silent, replaced by the frantic pounding of his own heart against his ribs. The water was cold, murky, and tasted of mud and decay. He pressed his body against the submerged roots of a cypress tree, his eyes squeezed shut, his entire being focused on the thin, precious stream of air coming through the reed. He could hear them now, their heavy boots squelching in the mud at the water's edge. They were mere feet from his hiding place. He could feel the vibrations through the water as they moved. "Damn swamp swallowed him whole," one of the men grumbled, his voice a distorted, watery sound. "Scent just stops here, same as the last one." Another man spat. "Let the gators have him. It's too hot to be chasing ghosts." Marcus remained perfectly still, a living statue of terror. He could see the dark shapes of their legs through the murky water, so close he could have reached out and touched them. A lifetime passed in those few agonizing moments. He fought the desperate urge to gasp for air, the burning in his lungs, the terror that threatened to make him bolt. Then, as slowly as they had come, the sounds and the vibrations receded. He waited, counting to 100, then 200, his heart still hammering against his ribs. When he finally dared to surface, gasping, sputtering, the world was silent again, save for the indifferent buzz of the insects. He was alone. He clung to the cypress root, his body trembling uncontrollably, the visceral terror of the moment leaving him weak and nauseous. Survival, he now understood, was not a grand destination. It was a thing measured in minutes and inches, in the space between a boot and a submerged head. He pushed on, driven by a fear that was now as potent as his hope. The hunger was a constant, dizzying companion, and his strength was failing. Despair, a cold and insidious vine, began to wrap itself around his heart. He was beginning to believe the slave catcher's words, that the swamp would swallow him whole. It was on the edge of this despair, when his legs would barely hold him and his vision was starting to blur, that he saw it. On the far bank of the creek, standing stark against the gloomy sky, were 3 great oak trees, their massive branches twisted and blackened, their tops shattered as if by a giant's axe. The 3 oaks struck by lightning. Elias's words echoed in his mind, a voice of hope from a world away. A surge of adrenaline, born of pure relief, propelled him across the creek. He scrambled up the muddy bank, his eyes scanning the ground around the base of the ancient trees. He found it almost immediately, a large fallen log, half hollowed by time and decay. His heart pounded with a new, hopeful rhythm. He reached into the dark, damp hollow, his fingers searching, and they closed around a small, waterproofed package wrapped tightly in oilcloth. He sat on the damp ground, his hands trembling as he unwrapped the bundle. Inside, he found a piece of dried, salted fish, a small, hard piece of flint, and most precious of all, a long strip of clean, dry linen. He stared at the contents, and a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled him washed over him. This was not just food. This was a message. It was an act of faith from a complete stranger, a sign from the invisible railroad that snaked its way through the darkest corners of the land. Someone had come here, to this exact spot, and left this for him, or for someone like him. Someone who they would never meet, never know, but who they considered a brother in the struggle. He was not entirely alone. The knowledge was more nourishing than any food could ever be. Hope, which had been a flickering, guttering candle flame, now roared back to life, a bright, defiant bonfire in the wilderness of his soul. He carefully rewrapped the flint in the linen and ate the fish slowly, savoring every salty, life-giving bite, his spirit renewed. Miles away, back on the Henderson plantation, another quieter act of sabotage was taking place. The hunt for Marcus had officially been scaled back, but Deputy Reed, his professional pride wounded by the inexplicable case, had not given up. He spent his evenings in Henderson's study, poring over hand-drawn maps of the county, trying to apply logic to a situation that seemed to defy it. Sarah, serving the master his dinner, moved through the room with her usual quiet efficiency, her face a carefully constructed mask of subservience and sorrow. She placed a pitcher of water on the table beside Reed, her eyes catching sight of the map he had laid out. It was covered in pencil marks, circles and lines that delineated the areas he had already searched and the ones he intended to sweep next. A new set of circles was concentrated on the marshlands to the west, a different area from the great dismal swamp, but dangerously close to the true path. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to do something. As she reached to pour Henderson a glass of water, her hand slipped. The pitcher tilted and a cascade of cool water spilled across the table, soaking the corner of the map where Reed had just been making his notes. "Oh, Master Henderson, forgive me," she cried, her voice a pitch-perfect blend of panic and clumsiness. "My hands, they're just so clumsy tonight," Henderson swore, jumping back as the water spread. Reed let out a grunt of pure frustration as he snatched up the map, but it was too late. The water had turned his meticulous pencil markings into a series of blurry, illegible smudges. The ink from his pen notes ran together, creating a meaningless blue stain. His plans for the next day's search were ruined. It was a small thing, a spilled pitcher of water. But in the silent, secret war being waged on the plantation, it was a significant victory. It was a small act of sabotage that might buy Marcus another day, another hour, another precious minute. Meanwhile, Elias continued his own campaign of psychological warfare. He moved among the other slaves and even the white farmhands, his voice a low, mysterious whisper. He spoke of the forge, of the ground it was built on, of the old stories his grandfather had told him. "That forge is on old ground," he told one of the men from the search party, his eyes dark and knowing. "The old folks, they said it was a place where the worlds touched, a place of power. Some things are best left alone." He would shake his head slowly, a sad, knowing look on his face. "That anvil, it has a spirit, a thirsty spirit. It took what it was owed." He planted these seeds of doubt and fear, watering them with cryptic hints and ancient folklore. He nurtured the supernatural legend of Marcus's disappearance, twisting it, shaping it, until it was a more potent weapon than any physical resistance. He was misdirecting not just their search, but their very understanding of reality, turning their own superstitions against them. The hunt for Marcus was no longer just a hunt for a man. It was a trespass into a spiritual realm, and the hunters were beginning to lose their nerve. Weeks turned into a month, and the legend of Marcus Daniels grew more potent with every passing day. The official hunt, once a furious and well-funded enterprise, had dwindled into a series of sporadic, half-hearted patrols. In Master Henderson's study, the air was thick with the stale smell of whiskey and impotent rage. The ledger on his desk, once a source of pride and a testament to his wealth, now seemed to mock him. The entry for Marcus, a name that had represented a value of over $2,000, was now a black hole, a void that had swallowed not just the man but a small fortune in search costs and lost productivity. Henderson stared out the window at the fields, his jaw tight. The whispers had reached him, the stories of forged spirits and supernatural disappearances. He saw it in the eyes of his other slaves, a new, unsettling flicker of something that was not quite defiance but was certainly no longer absolute fear. It was a quiet, knowing look, and it infuriated him more than any open rebellion. Deputy Reed sat opposite him, his own frustration a colder, more methodical thing. The file on his lap remained stubbornly thin. It contained witness statements that all told the same impossible story, a crude map of the forge, and a report on the failed hound search. It was a file full of questions and impossibilities, a monument to a single inexplicable event that had unraveled his belief in a logical, orderly world. He had exhausted every avenue, every theory. There was no tunnel, no hidden passage he could find, no evidence of outside help. There was only a toppled anvil, a dead overseer, and a ghost. Henderson finally turned from the window, his face pale and drawn. He looked older, the lines of authority on his face now just lines of weariness. "It's over, Reed," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual booming confidence. "Call them off. All of them." Reed looked up, surprised. "Sir, we could still what?" Henderson snapped, his voice cracking. "Waste more of my money chasing a ghost? He's gone. Let the swamp have him. Let the spirits have him for all I care. He's no use to me dead, and he's worth less to me as a phantom who costs me a fortune and puts ideas in the heads of my other property." He spat the word property as if it tasted foul. The financial loss was galling, but the erosion of his authority, the quiet mockery of the legend, was a wound that would not close. Deputy Reed slowly closed the file. He knew this was a defeat, not just for Henderson, but for him. He stood, nodding curtly. "As you wish, Mr. Henderson." He left the study, but he did not file the case away. He kept it on the corner of his desk, a permanent, visible reminder of the one puzzle he could not solve. The one man who had simply stepped out of the world, leaving only a question mark behind. The official search for Marcus Daniels was over. He was, for all intents and purposes, declared lost, a phantom swallowed by the earth. The end of the official hunt did not end the story, it immortalized it. The tale of Marcus the Blacksmith, the man who struck the anvil and walked into the sky, became a powerful piece of folklore, a currency of hope traded in whispers in the dead of night. It traveled from plantation to plantation, carried by itinerant workers, escaped slaves, and the invisible network that connected the enslaved communities of Virginia and beyond. The story changed with each telling, embellished and expanded until it took on the quality of a sacred myth. In some versions, the anvil itself had come alive, a golem of iron and rage to smite the wicked overseer. In others, Marcus had forged a key from a bolt of lightning and unlocked a door in the air itself. The most popular version, the one that brought a glimmer of light to the eyes of those who heard it, was that the spirits of his African ancestors had reached through the veil of the world, wrapped him in a cloak of smoke and fire, and carried him home. The story was more than just a fantastical tale. It was a quiet but profound act of rebellion. It was a testament to the idea that resistance, even in the face of overwhelming power, was possible. It suggested that the masters, for all their whips and chains and laws, were not omnipotent. There were forces in the world, whether spiritual or human, that they could not control. The legend of Marcus became a secret scripture, a source of inspiration that fortified the soul. It was a story told to children in hushed tones, a story that planted a seed of defiance, a belief that one's spirit could never truly be owned, even if one's body was in chains. The deafening clang of the anvil had echoed far beyond the Henderson plantation, becoming a silent, resonant note of hope in the hearts of thousands. A year passed. The city of Philadelphia was a world away from the humid stillness of a Virginia plantation. It was a city of noise, of commerce, of movement. The air smelled not of damp earth and fear, but of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys, of baking bread, of the salty tang of the nearby Delaware River. Here the clang of a hammer on an anvil was not the sound of coercion, but the sound of creation and commerce, the heartbeat of a bustling, thriving city. In a small but busy blacksmith shop in a modest neighborhood, a man who called himself Isaac worked the forge. He was leaner than the man who had vanished from Virginia, the soft roundness of his face replaced by the hard, weathered lines of a man who had known hardship and hunger. But the frantic, hunted look was gone from his eyes. In its place was a deep, calm light, the quiet confidence of a man who was his own master. He was a free man, working for a wage, his labor his own to sell. A customer, a well-dressed merchant, watched as Isaac finished shaping a set of intricate hinges, his hammer blows precise and economical. "You have a real gift with that hammer, Isaac," the merchant said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Best smith in this part of the city, I'd wager." Isaac quenched the hot iron, a cloud of steam hissing into the air. He nodded, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "I had a good teacher," he said, his voice a low baritone. He thought of the Henderson forge, of the searing heat and the endless, brutal labor. He thought of the fire and fury that had taught him control, that had forced him to learn the language of the iron, to understand its every mood and temper. The skills that had been forged in the crucible of his enslavement were now the tools of his liberation, the foundation of his new life. The climax of his year of uncertainty arrived on a cool autumn afternoon. The shop was quiet, the day's work mostly done. A man entered, his plain gray clothes and broad-brimmed hat marking him as a Quaker. He was a known abolitionist, a quiet conductor on the Underground Railroad, a man who risked his own freedom for the freedom of others. He approached the forge, his expression serene. He did not speak of business. He simply looked at Isaac, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, and handed him a small, folded piece of paper. Isaac's heart began to pound, a heavy, frantic rhythm against his ribs. He took the letter, his calloused fingers trembling slightly. The Quaker gave a slight nod and left as quietly as he had come. Isaac waited until the man was gone before he unfolded the paper. His breath caught in his throat. There were no words inside, only a simple, crude drawing done in charcoal. It was a picture of a single bright star, hanging in the sky above a winding river, and next to the river, perched on a branch, was a small, intricately drawn bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It was the code, the star to guide them, the river to hide them, and the bird to remember him by. It was the message he and Sarah had devised in whispered tones in the dark of their cabin, a message of impossible hope. It meant she and Eliza were safe. They had escaped. They were on their way north. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming, it was a physical force that almost buckled his knees. He gripped the handle of a new hammer he had just finished forging, the wood smooth and sure in his hand. The weight of a year of sleepless nights, of constant, gnawing uncertainty, of imagining the worst, of praying for the impossible, lifted from his shoulders. He had not known until this very moment how heavy it had been. He had carried it with him every day, a cold, hard knot of fear in the pit of his stomach. Now it was gone. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in over a year, he allowed himself to see their faces, not as a painful memory, but as a future promise. Sarah and Eliza. They were coming home. The story of what happened to Finch and the significant financial loss from Marcus's impossible escape had tarnished Henderson's reputation. His power, once seen as absolute and unassailable in the county, had been shown to have limits. The whispers and rumors, the story of the man who vanished, had created a crack in his foundation of fear. He was no longer the master who could not be defied, but the master who had been outwitted by a ghost. The echo of the Anvil had shaken his world, and it would never be quite the same. That evening, as dusk settled over Philadelphia, turning the sky to a soft palette of purple and gray, Isaac stood outside his shop. He was no longer Marcus of Virginia, a name on a ledger, a piece of property valued for his strength. He was Isaac, the blacksmith, the husband, the father. He looked north, down the long road that led into the heart of the city, the road that would, one day soon, bring his family to him. The air was cool and carried the promise of a new season. The deafening, violent clang of the anvil, the sound that had shattered his world and set him free, had finally been replaced by a new sound, the quiet, hopeful silence of a man waiting for his family to come home. The story of his life was no longer one of bondage. It was a story of a future he had hammered into existence with his own two hands,